In this video, we're going to get familiar with some terms that we use when we're talking about the internet. Now, the internet is a collection of computers that are connected together across the world. So, the internet. So that's the internet, which is often confused with the World Wide Web, www. But that's actually the pages of information or the resources that are on the internet. So the World Wide Web are the pages, resources on the internet. So when we're talking about the internet, we're talking about the computers, the cables, the connections. We're talking about the infrastructure. Now let's take an example. So I'm going to have a server here, and I'm taking some of this information from a past paper, an AS level past paper actually. Move this up so that you can see it. Now this is a server on the internet. It's a computer on the internet that provides a service, that provides information. So it is a host. So a host computer stores a particular resource on the internet. So that's a host. And this is going to be, we're going to use this example as a one from OCR, the exam board. Now it has an address. Now the address that we talk about on the internet, we talk about an IP address. So the IP address for this computer is, for example, 192.149.119.226. So that there is the IP address. IP standing for Internet Protocol. And we will be learning more about protocols in another lesson. So if another computer needs to access this, it needs to know that IP address. That's how the internet works. However, we typically as humans don't go around learning these numbers ourselves. So we have a much more friendly address that we use, which is called a URL. The URL is a uniform resource locator. And let's just think about how we would access the OCR website. We would type in www.ocr.org.uk. And we would typically add some information to that, like curriculum, past papers, and so on. But right now, we're just putting in the main website URL. And typically in front of this, we would have something that looks like this. And that is what protocol we are using. And we will learn more about protocols in another lesson. For now, that is the address that I would type in here if I want to access the OCR website, which is being hosted by this computer over here. So let's just say this is our web browser. So we use a web browser to access pages on the internet. So that is software. An example would be Safari. And we type in the URL, uniform resource locator. So we type this in, However, this computer that we have typed this address into needs to put a request for a page of information from this server over here, this host computer, and it needs this IP address. So somehow, somewhere, we need to be able to link this address here, this URL, to that IP address. And that's basically where the domain name system comes in. So the domain name system takes what we call these friendly URLs. That's like quite an easy one for me to remember, generally. So it'll take this, it will look it up, and it will find the corresponding IP address. And that's what this computer then will need to use to do a request to that server. However, if it doesn't find it, it will just pass it on to another domain name server, and so on until it is found. So let's draw a domain name server here. And in this server, we have got URLs and corresponding IP addresses. Let's take, for example, I got my writing, www.bbc.co.uk, and let's just make up an address for that. 196.187.89. Okay, just all made it. And there'll be lots of URLs along here, and there may well be the OCR one. And we know that one is going to be 192.149.119.226. Now there's two sort of different exam style questions that can come up with this. So let's take them in turn. The first one could be, compare a URL with an IP address. And that's quite straightforward. This URL here can have words or characters, whereas the IP address just has numbers. This URL here also contains the protocol that's being used, whereas this only has the address. This one is easier for people to remember. However, it does need to be converted to the IP address before it can be useful and find the information that we need. So that's how we would compare the two. Another thing we might be asked is how the domain name system works. And we tend to use domain name system and domain name server interchangeably. However, when we're talking about domain name system, we're talking about the system overall and not one individual server. So how would we answer a question how it works? Well, we first of all say that the user types a URL into the browser. And then a request needs to go from this computer to the host for whatever information, whatever page that it needs. So usually, of course, you'd have your / and your page there. If this computer does not know the IP address, then it can't get the information. It first of all then will go to a domain name server. And the domain name server will take that URL and it'll look it up in its table. And if it finds it, it will return the corresponding IP address. However, if it's not there, it will then forward that request onto another domain name server. And if that one has it, so let's see if you can see that. Quite. So if it was not successful finding an IP address here, it will then forward on to another domain name server. And if that one doesn't have one, it will go on to another one, and so on. It will keep doing this until it is successful and it finds the IP address that it needs, which will then get returned to this computer here. Once it has the IP address, it can retrieve the information that it needs. Okay, so very quick summary, and I'll check that you can see what I'm pointing at. Yeah, the user puts in the IP address here. Sorry, the user puts in the URL here. The corresponding IP address will be retrieved from the domain name system, and that's done by, first of all, looking at domain name server, passing it the URL, and it looks up a table to find the corresponding IP address. If it's not there, it'll then go and ask another domain name server until it gets it. And once this computer here has got the IP address, it'll be able to go to that host computer and retrieve the information that it needs. Okay, so in this short video, we have looked at the internet being the infrastructure of connected computers across the world, which underpins the World Wide Web, which is pages of useful resources. We looked at domain name service, allowing us to convert URLs to IP addresses. Talked about a host computer as a particular resource or service on the internet, and we looked at the IP address. Each device on the internet has an IP address, its own unique address. And of course, we talked about the website. So that's quite a lot of internet terminology for this lesson.